The bikers tried to break Terence Hill in his own restaurant, but they had no idea the silent giant at the bar was about to make them regret every second of it. By 7 o'clock, the place had settled into the kind of rhythm Terence Hill liked best, steady and ordinary, with enough clatter to sound alive, and enough calm to make a man think the world had not entirely gone sour. The restaurant sat on a side street where the neon outside hummed more than it shined, and inside there were old wooden tables, a long bar polished by years of elbows, and the warm smell of grilled meat, onions, fresh bread, and beer. Nothing in it looked expensive, and that was part of the point. Terence had not opened the place to impress anybody. He had opened it because, after a lifetime of cameras, fake saloons, staged fights, and people telling him where to stand, he had wanted one room in the world that felt honest. A man came in hungry, sat down, ate well, laughed if he felt like it, and went home a little better than when he arrived. That night, though, the place meant a little more to him than usual. He moved between the tables with a crutch tucked under one arm and a limp he tried to hide without much success. A few days earlier, he had taken a bad knock to the leg, and the injury had left him slower than he liked, which was saying something because he had never been built for standing still. Even hurt, though, there was a spring in his face that the bad leg could not touch. His eyes still carried that sly shine. His mouth kept threatening to smile. He looked, in other words, like a man in pain who had decided pain would simply have to wait its turn. He leaned one shoulder against the end of the bar and spoke to the old manager for the third or fourth time in the last hour, though the manager had heard the same speech often enough by then to say most of it along with him. "You know," Terence would say with a chuckle, his voice easy like they were just two fellas shooting the breeze, "my best friend in the whole world is coming by tonight. I've been waiting on him all day. If he sees this leg of mine all messed up like this, you bet he's gonna laugh and give this old man a hard time about it." The manager, a narrow older man who had worked in restaurants long enough to distrust both optimism and dinner rushes, dried a glass with slow care and gave him a side look. A real friend would ask how you got hurt. Terence lifted one hand. That's after the laughing. First comes the insult, then maybe concern. He's a traditionalist. The manager shook his head, but a smile tugged at him anyway. Terence had been in that sort of mood all evening, more talkative than usual, more restless, and with a cheerful edge that spread out into the room whether people wanted it or not. He told one table the meatballs were better than medicine, told another the house wine had saved 2 marriages and ended 3 bad engagements, and when an older couple asked if he was really Terence Hill, he answered, "Only on weekdays," which pleased them more than a serious answer would have. He kept glancing at the door. The street outside was washed in dim amber light, and every set of headlights that rolled past drew his attention for a moment before moving on. He could almost picture the arrival he had built up in his head. A large shadow in the doorway. Heavy steps. The kind of face that made trouble recalculate. He knew his friend too well not to laugh at the thought. For all his size, that man had always had a talent for entering a room as if he were merely passing through it on the way to a sandwich. The manager came to stand near him. "You've checked the door more than I've checked the register." Terence spoke without looking away from the glass. "That's because the register is here. My friend, unfortunately, is not. Maybe he'll surprise you." Terence turned his head and gave the manager a look full of cheerful disbelief. "No. He's far too lame for that." They both laughed, and the sound settled back into the room as easy as breath. Suddenly, the front door flew inward with a hard slam that cracked through the room and silenced nearly every sound at once. 5 bikers stepped inside, all leather jackets, heavy boots, and faces set hard like they owned the world. Their leader stepped ahead of the others without hurry. He looked around once, took in the tables, the customers, the bar, the framed pictures on the wall, and then let his eyes settle on Terence. Well, there it was. Recognition. A crooked smile slid over the biker's face. "Would you look at that?" he said. "It really is you." Nobody answered him. Terence straightened a little on his crutch. The man spread his hands as if arriving at a pleasant business opportunity. "Well, well, look at this. A washed-up movie star playing restaurant owner in this dump. That's real cute." Real cute. Means you got plenty of cash stashed away, even if you're trying to hide it behind these shitty lights and these pathetic second-hand chairs that smell like old grease. A few customers shifted in their seats. The manager behind the bar went still, his glass towel frozen in one hand. Terence did not move from where he stood, though the cheer that had carried him through the evening now settled into something flatter and cooler. Not fear, just attention. The biker leader kept talking, enjoying the room he had captured. Here's how this works. From now on, this place pays for protection. You pay, your windows stay where they are, your tables stay in one piece, and your customers keep enjoying their dinner. You don't pay, we make a mess. Simple enough. The four men behind him fanned out slowly, boots thudding heavy on the wooden floor. One of them immediately swept his arm across the nearest table, knocking plates and glasses crashing to the ground. Another grabbed a chair and slammed it down hard, cracking one of the legs. A third biker kicked over a metal trash can in the corner, sending it rolling loudly across the room. The last one picked up a bottle from the bar and smashed it against the edge of a table, letting the glass shatter everywhere. They weren't just standing there anymore. They were breaking things on purpose, slow and deliberate, making sure everybody understood what would happen if they didn't pay up. Terence watched them tear up his restaurant and stayed calm. He planted the crutch more firmly and took a step forward. The pain in his leg showed for a second, a quick tightening at the mouth, but it passed and left his expression sharper than before. "You boys charge extra for original ideas," he said, "or is this the same dumb racket you use everywhere?" A few heads turned toward him at once. The manager almost closed his eyes. The biker leader's smile thinned. "You ought to be careful, old man." Terence shrugged with one shoulder. "I would, but I'm busy running a restaurant." The biker closest to Terence took one step in, then another, enjoying himself already. The leader motioned around the room. "No need to make this hard. We ain't looking to beat on an old man. You made movies. You made money. You give us a little peace, stay in your lane, and we all keep the peace." "I think you walked into the wrong restaurant," Terence said. It was a hard line, and under other circumstances maybe it would have landed like a warning. But tonight he stood with a damaged leg and a crutch instead of the easy balance he had once carried on 100 film sets. The bikers saw weakness and trusted what they saw. That was the trouble with men who enjoyed bullying. They mistook a disadvantage for surrender long before either one had been offered. The leader moved closer. "You gonna pay or not?" Terence lifted his chin and met his eyes. "Not." The answer fell clean and plain between them. One of the bikers muttered something ugly. Another gave a short laugh and nudged a chair aside with his boot. The customers looked trapped now, caught between wanting to leave and knowing sudden movement might invite the first blow. The manager had gone pale, though he tried not to show it. For a long second, the room held itself in suspension, every person in it waiting for the next thing. That was when the door opened again. This time it was not loud, just a push, a draft, and the sound of heavy steps crossing the threshold. A large man came in wearing simple clothes that did nothing to hide the size of him. He was broad through the shoulders, thick in the chest, and moved with the plain economy of someone who had no intention of wasting energy on showing off. He paused only long enough to look around. His eyes passed over the tables, the bikers, Terence, the bar, the customers who had gone stiff with worry. If he recognized the trouble, and he clearly did, he gave no sign of alarm. Then he walked right through it, not hurried. He simply passed the bikers, crossed to the bar, and sat down on a stool as if he had come for supper and saw no reason for the evening's nonsense to interfere with it. The manager stared at him. The big man rested one forearm on the counter. "What's good tonight?" No one answered right away. The question was so ordinary it almost made the scene absurd. Terence, however, had seen him. The change in his face was small enough that most people would have missed it. His mouth loosened at one corner. Then, just as quickly, he did something stranger. He eased back. The set of his shoulders softened. The hard edge in his voice vanished. His grip on the crutch seemed less defiant now, more dependent. He looked, all at once, much older, much more tired, and a good deal less willing to keep the argument alive. The biker leader noticed that too, and mistook it exactly the way Terence hoped he would. "Well now," the man said, turning back toward him, pleased by what he read as retreat. "That sounds smarter." Terence lowered his eyes for a beat and sighed like a man finally worn down by bad odds. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe tonight's not the night." From behind the bar, the manager blinked in surprise. He knew Terence well enough to know surrender did not sit naturally on him. The big man still had not turned around. He waited for the menu as if all he cared about was supper. For a second or two, the room seemed to ease up, like maybe the worst had passed. But the leader of the bikers was not the kind to let things go that easy. He studied Terence with narrow eyes, then gave a short nod to one of his boys. That fellow stepped forward without saying a word and kicked hard at the crutch Terence was leaning on. The crutch shot sideways. Terence lost his balance, and he went down flat on the wooden floor with a heavy smack that echoed off the walls. Right away, the whole bunch started laughing loud and rough, like they had just heard the best joke in town. It was not a fair hit. They had gone straight for the bad leg. The one everybody could see was already giving him trouble, and used it to drop him like he was some clumsy kid instead of a grown man who owned the place. Terence lay there a moment, jaw tight, breathing through his nose. Then he rolled over and started dragging himself across the floor toward the nearest chair so he could grab hold and pull himself back up. You could see the effort in his shoulders and the way his bad leg dragged behind him, but there was still that stubborn set to his face, the kind that said he was not about to stay down no matter how much it hurt. He got his hand on the seat of the chair and started to push himself up, slow and careful. Just as he made it halfway, another biker walked over casual as you please and kicked the chair out from under him. Terence dropped again, arms flailing, hitting the floor even harder this time. The laughter from the bikers got louder and meaner, like they were starting to have real fun with it now. A couple of the older customers at the back tables turned their heads away, staring down at their plates or out the dark window, anything so they would not have to keep watching. The air in the restaurant felt heavier, the kind of thick, helpless feeling that settles in when you know something wrong is happening and you do not have the guts or the strength to stop it. Behind the bar, the manager let out a long breath and wiped his hands on his apron over and over. He glanced sideways at the big man sitting there and muttered under his breath, just loud enough to be heard by him, "This is getting out of hand. They're making a fool out of him and enjoying every minute of it. Somebody ought to do something before it gets worse." The big man did not answer. He just kept looking straight ahead at the bar top, fingers loose around his glass of beer, like the noise and the trouble were happening on somebody else's television set. Two of the bikers stepped in closer, still grinning. They bent down, grabbed Terence under the arms, and hauled him back to his feet like they were being neighborly. "Easy there, old-timer," one of them said with a fake, friendly voice. "We don't want you hurting yourself." Terence had barely found his footing, one hand still reaching for the crutch that was now too far away, when the leader swung his open hand hard across Terence's face. The slap cracked loud enough to make a couple of glasses rattle on the tables. Terence's head snapped to the side and he went down again in a heap, landing on his side this time. The leader stood over him, shaking his head like he was disappointed. "Look at that. Big, famous movie star. Can't even stay on his feet in his own joint. All those pictures where you looked tough. Guess they had somebody else doing the fighting for you, huh? Now you're just an old cripple running a greasy spoon and still too stupid to pay what you owe." Terence pushed himself up on one elbow, wiped a little blood from the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked up at them. One of the bikers kicked a table nearby, sending salt and pepper shakers flying and a half-full glass of beer spilling across the wood. Another one walked over and deliberately stepped on Terence's crutch, snapping the wooden shaft with a loud crack. The leader leaned down closer. "You think this is funny? You think we're playing games here? We know who you are, Terence Hill. Used to be somebody. Now you're just a broke down, has been hiding behind these cheap tables and bad lights. And you still won't pay up? Fine. We'll take it out of your hide instead." The big man at the bar let out a quiet sigh. He set his glass down slow, pushed the stool back, and stood up. Without a word, he walked over to where Terence was still on the floor. He bent down, grabbed the back of Terence's belt with one big hand, and lifted him straight up like he was picking up an empty feed sack. Then he set Terence down easy on the nearest table so the old man could sit instead of lying there anymore. After that, he reached down, picked up the broken pieces of the crutch, and handed them back to Terence without saying anything. Terence blinked a couple times, took the crutch, and gave a small nod. "Thanks," he said quietly. The big man did not answer. He just turned around and walked back to his stool at the bar, sat down in the same spot, like nothing much had happened, like he had only helped somebody who dropped a quarter on the floor. He picked up his beer again and took another slow sip. That simple move set the bikers off worse than anything else that night. They had been having their fun knocking Terence around, feeling big and in charge, and now this quiet stranger had stepped in and ruined it without even raising his voice. The leader's face twisted up. The four others moved fast, boots loud on the wood, and crowded right behind the big man's back. One biker muttered, "Who the hell does he think he is?" Another said it louder. "Hey." The big man did not turn. The leader took 2 strides toward the bar. I said, "Hey." Still nothing. By then, Terence had adjusted himself on the tabletop, tugged his jacket straight, and settled the crutch across his knees. He looked down at the bikers and then over at the stranger's broad back. The corner of his mouth twitched. They threatened to break every bone in the man's body if he did not turn around and face them. The words got louder and uglier, bouncing off the walls of the little restaurant, but the big man never moved. He kept his back to them, shoulders relaxed, staring at the row of bottles behind the bar like he could not hear a single word. Not one twitch, not one glance over his shoulder. It was like their shouting was just wind blowing past an old oak tree. Terence was still sitting on the table, brushing off the front of his shirt like he had all the time in the world. He looked over at the bikers and said in a calm, matter-of-fact voice, "Might be the man can't hear you." "Could be. He's deaf." The bikers did not like that at all. Their yelling got even louder. They called the big man names again, louder this time, telling him to turn around or they would make him regret it. Still nothing. The big man just sat there, calm as ever. One of the younger bikers lost his temper completely. He pulled a pistol out from under his jacket, pointed it up at the ceiling, and fired one shot. The bang was loud in that small room. A couple of women screamed. Glasses rattled on the tables. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Everybody in the place jumped, including the manager who ducked down behind the bar for a second. But the big man at the bar did not even flinch. He did not turn his head. He did not spill a drop of his beer. He just kept sitting there like the shot had been nothing more than somebody clearing their throat. Now even the bikers looked briefly thrown. Then, because men like that cannot bear being made to feel foolish, they turned at once to mockery. "He really is deaf." "No," said another, laughing. "He's deaf and stupid. Maybe both," the leader said. "Big as an ox and twice as slow." A couple of them laughed too hard, the sound brittle with anger rather than amusement. They figured they had him figured out. The leader stepped forward, lifted his heavy boot, and brought it down hard right on top of the big man's foot, grinding it in. That finally got a reaction. The big man set his glass down carefully, turned his head slow, and looked back over his shoulder at the whole bunch of them. He did not say a word. Instead, he raised his big hands and started making the strangest motions, like he was talking with sign language. He pointed up at the ceiling, then at his own chest, opened his palms wide, twisted his wrists, shrugged his shoulders, made a face with his lips pushed out, then did a few more big, exaggerated movements that looked more like clowning around than any real threat. One part looked like he was milking a cow, another like he was throwing somebody out a window, and another like he was kneading dough for bread. The whole thing was so overdone and silly it hardly looked like communication at all. The bikers stood there with their mouths half open, not sure what to make of it. They had expected the man to get mad or scared or at least say something back. Instead, they were watching this giant fellow put on what looked like the worst mime act they had ever seen. The bikers just stared. The leader frowned. "What the hell is this?" The big man kept going. Now he made a shape as though milking a cow. Then another that looked suspiciously like tossing somebody out a window. Then he worked both hands together as if kneading bread dough, his expression unchanged, his movements solemn enough to make the whole thing even more ridiculous. Terence cleared his throat from his spot on the table and spoke up in a serious voice, like he was doing important business. "I know sign language," he said. "Been around it some over the years." The big man kept going with his strange hand motions, making them bigger and sillier as he went. Terence watched carefully, then started answering back with his own hands while still holding the broken crutch. He nodded like he understood every bit of it, raised his eyebrows, pointed at the bikers, then made a big sweeping motion like somebody was getting thrown clear up to the ceiling and landing in a pile. The two of them went back and forth like that, Terence translating with his hands and the big man adding more ridiculous gestures. At one point it looked like the big man was describing how to wring a chicken's neck, then how to flip a pancake. The whole thing got so ridiculous that a little boy sitting with his family in the corner let out a sudden laugh. A couple more people in the room tried to hold it in, but could not. Pretty soon, a few quiet chuckles turned into real laughter spreading through the restaurant. The bikers stood there frozen for a moment, their faces going from angry to confused to downright embarrassed. The fear that had filled the room earlier was draining away fast, replaced by something else. The leader's face was tight with frustration. He had come in expecting easy money and easy fear, but now the whole restaurant was laughing at his crew because of a couple of old-timers putting on a silly show. The big man slowly turned back toward the bar like he was done with the conversation. Terence stayed sitting on the table, still holding what was left of his crutch, a small, satisfied look on his face as he watched the bikers try to figure out what had just happened to their control of the room. Terence glanced back at the big man's hands and kept going in the same calm tone. "Now he says if you stay, he's gonna fold you up, stack you by the door, and send the smell of you out into the street." A couple of the bikers shifted at that. The big man signed again, wider this time, one hand cutting through the air, the other pointing straight at them. Terence's face stayed serious. "No, wait, he wants that clearer. He says when he's done, you won't look like bikers anymore. You'll look like laundry somebody beat against a rock." The leader took a step forward. "You think this is funny?" Terence frowned as if offended by the interruption. "I'm translating." The big man went on with another long stretch of nonsense gestures, now looking as solemn as a judge. Terence followed every motion with care. "He says the tall one goes through the window first. The loud one lands on the table, and the one with the gun better pray he runs fastest." Now the biker with the gun lost his grin. Terence lifted the broken crutch a little and added, still sounding like a man doing honest work, "And he says if any of you are wondering whether he means it, you can stay put and find out the hard way." The leader's face changed in a way everybody in the room could read. Until then, he had still been trying to hold on to the shape of things, trying to act like he was in control, and all this foolishness was just a delay before the old fear settled back where it belonged. He took one hard step toward Terence and jabbed a finger at him. "What the hell did that old ox just say?" Terence looked at him with a straight face, almost patient now, as if he had been waiting for the question and was glad the man had finally asked it the right way. He glanced once at the big man's hands, though the signs by then had wandered so far from anything sensible that even a saint would have given up following them, and then he turned back to the leader. "He says," Terence replied, grave as a church usher, "you boys ought to get out of here right now. Otherwise, in about a minute, you're all gonna get pounded flat, soft as wet noodles left soaking in dishwater." For one beat, the room held still. Then every biker in sight snapped his attention toward Terence. The leader's lips parted. The man with the gun tightened up through the shoulders. Another one, the tall one Terence had just mentioned, frowned as though his own imagination had betrayed him and shown him exactly how it might feel to go through a window. Whatever little comic haze had drifted into the room a minute earlier was gone now. In its place came that sharp, dangerous silence that arrives just before men stop posturing and start swinging, and that was the opening. The biker with the gun had not yet raised it again. He had it low at his side, careless from anger, trusting the crowding of the room and the age of the two men in front of him to keep things easy. He barely had time to register motion before the big man turned, reached, and took the gun away from him. It did not happen like a struggle. It happened like a correction. One thick hand closed over the weapon, twisted it free, and in the same motion brought the grip up hard under the gunman's jaw. The crack of bone-meeting metal was not loud compared to the shot from moments earlier, but it was uglier, closer, more personal. The gunman's head snapped back. His knees forgot what they were for. He dropped straight down against the side of a table and took the tablecloth with him, silverware skating after him onto the floor. The leader yelled something, but by then the big man was already moving. The pistol, which had entered the moment as threat, became a club before the second man even thought to duck. The big man swung it short and brutal into the side of that biker's head, then drove the barrel backward into another one's belly with such force that the fellow folded over both arms and stumbled blind into a chair. At the same time, the stranger's left hand came up in one of those famous open-palmed blows that looked half lazy until it landed. And when it landed, it sounded like somebody slapping wet laundry against a wall. The biker on the receiving end spun clear around and crashed into the bar stools, taking two of them over with him. What followed no longer resembled a roomful of men working out an argument. It looked more like a weather event. The big man planted his feet once and became the center of a storm. Every movement was short, direct, and heavy enough to change the furniture. He hit without flourish. He did not waste effort. A shoulder went into one chest and sent its owner sliding over a table edge. A forearm caught another man across the throat and drove him backward until his spine bounced off the bar. One slap sent a biker stumbling sideways into a display of bottles so hard that the bottles rang against each other like bells, and one of them fell, rolled, and poured whiskey onto the floorboards. The customers cried out and drew back where they could. Chairs scraped. One couple dropped low behind their table. The manager, who had been clinging to the bar as if it were the only fixed thing in his world, stepped out of the line of flying men and broken glass and simply stared. He had hoped for intervention, no doubt about that, but hope in an old man's heart is usually modest. It asks for one good shove, one hard warning, something enough to stop the shame. It does not always prepare itself for judgment, descending on leather boots in the shape of a mountain. Terence, meanwhile, still sat on the table. He had the broken crutch across his lap and a look on his face that suggested this was not only acceptable but deeply satisfying. His cheek was still red. His legs still hurt. His jacket was dusty. None of that seemed to trouble him half as much now that the room had changed sides. He watched with the pleased focus of a man seeing a familiar craft practiced by an old master. The leader charged first and got the worst of that decision immediately. He came in trying to tackle, head down and arms wide, because that is what angry men do when they believe size is just a matter of pushing harder. The big man half-turned, let the rush come close, then brought the pistol grip down on the back of the leader's neck. The man's knees hit before the rest of him knew they were supposed to, and while he was dropping he caught a second blow, open-handed and vicious, that sent him sprawling across a table already half covered in beer. Still, Terence did not move. He chuckled once under his breath. Then the remaining bikers, acting on the old dumb instinct of numbers, came all at once. One went low, one high, one from the side, and the one with the busted mouth managed to get back enough sense to lunge in from behind. For a brief moment they had the big man crowded in a knot of arms and leather and bad choices. The tables shook. A chair flew backward, somebody's elbow knocked over a basket of rolls. The big man disappeared from clean view under the tangle. That was the moment he raised his voice for the first time. "Get your ass over here." Terence's smile widened. "Knew it," he said. Then he moved. For a man with a bad leg and half a crutch, he rose faster than most healthy men stand up from supper. He came off the table with one good foot planted clean, the injured leg guarded but not babied, and the surviving length of crutch in his hand no longer looked like support. It looked like a tool he had grown up, waiting to misuse. The first biker never saw him come. Terence swung the crutch low and sharp into the man's wrist just as he reached toward the big man's collar. The hand opened at once. That is the beauty of a wrist strike when properly timed. It does not require much strength, only meanness and accuracy, and Terence had plenty of the second when the moment called for it. The biker yelped, spun halfway toward this new problem, and caught Terence's elbow in the stomach before he could gather himself. The breath left him in a grunt. Terence stepped aside and let him stumble into the path of the big man's backhand, which laid him out across two chairs. From there, the fight changed shape again. It had been one huge man punishing a pack. Now it became a pair, and not just any pair, but one of those odd, natural pairings that look ridiculous until they start working and then make everything else on Earth seem overcomplicated. The big man opened holes. Terence slipped into them. The big man stopped bodies. Terence rearranged what parts of those bodies still wanted to argue. One used weight like a battering ram. The other used timing like a gambler, palming the last good card. A biker tried to rush Terence, seeing the limp and guessing weak prey. Terence planted the crutch, shifted his weight with a wince he refused to dwell on, and hooked the fellow's ankle with his good foot. It was an old trick, cheap and perfect. The biker went down not because the fall was hard, but because he had committed all his confidence to forward motion and found out too late that confidence has no traction on a slick floor. Before he could rise, Terence jabbed the crutch into his ribs and stepped past him. Another one swung wild at the big man's head. The big man caught the punch on one forearm as if checking the weather, then answered with an open-handed slap so mighty and offended sounding that even the customers ducked by reflex. The biker flew sideways into the wall, rebounded, and slid down it to a sitting position with his eyes trying to remember where the rest of the room had gone. The leader got back up once, which was to his credit in a narrow physical sense, though morally it only proved stubbornness and poor planning. He came at Terence this time, perhaps thinking the hurt leg promised easier revenge. Terence gave him 2 limping steps backward, enough to make him commit, and then the big man appeared from the side and hit the leader in the shoulder with such force that the man changed direction mid-thought and crashed into the end of the bar, where the manager, with admirable professionalism, calmly moved the cash box out of reach before the body hit. There was hardly any talking now, only noises. Grunts, boots sliding, glass breaking, a chair splitting, a muttered curse from Terence when his bad leg had to do more than he wanted, and once in a while the unmistakable sound of the big man's hand connecting with another portion of biker. That sound began to take on its own legend in the room. Every time it landed, somebody fell. Terence worked around him like a fox around a bear. He never stayed where a larger man wanted him. He darted in, jabbed the crutch into a soft belly or a reaching forearm, clipped a knee, then drifted out again while the big man handled the outrage. Once, he used the crutch to hook the back of a biker's jacket and steer him directly into a descending blow that folded the poor fool over a table edge. Another time, he rapped the gunman across the knuckles as the man tried to recover the pistol from where it had skidded under a chair. The weapon spun farther away. The biker howled. The big man, not even looking down, nudged it with his boot out of reach, and then sat another man down with one hand to the chest. The odd thing, if anybody in the room still had enough calm to notice odd things, was how natural the 2 old men looked together. They had not spoken strategy. They had not signaled much beyond that one shouted command. Yet each knew where the other would be. Terence seemed to trust the big man's bulk the way a good thief trusts darkness. The big man seemed to trust Terence's timing the way a good mule trusts the road home. The years between them, the old jokes, the old fights, the old ways of reading each other's bad habits and better instincts, all of it seemed to live in the space between one blow and the next. A biker lunged from the side with a broken chair leg in his hand. Terence saw it, shouted a warning, and the big man ducked just enough for the club to sail over his shoulder. Before the attacker could recover, Terence slammed the crutch into the back of his knee. Down he went. The big man finished it with a cuff to the ear that sent him rolling into his friends. The friends were no longer friends in any useful tactical sense. They had become obstacles to one another, tripping over boots, stumbling into tables, turning too late, getting in each other's way because panic destroys teamwork faster than pain. The leader tried to rally them once and got caught in the middle of his own attempt when the tall biker backed into him. They went down together. Terence laughed aloud then, not cruelly exactly, but with the open enjoyment of a man who had endured enough humiliation to find this reversal not only fair but overdue. Within another minute, the fight had ceased being a contest and become housekeeping. The big man drove one biker backward across the room with nothing more elaborate than repeated forward steps and repeated heavy hands, until the fellow tripped over another's legs and ended up in a heap by the corner. Terence caught the gunman trying to crawl toward the door and tapped the back of his head with the crutch. "Wrong direction," he said, then shoved him toward the same growing pile. The leader made one last attempt to stand tall, only to take a straight shove to the chest from the big man that put him on top of the others like the final sack in a badly loaded wagon. And there they stayed. 5 bikers. One corner of the restaurant. Bruised faces, split lips, swelling eyes. Bad breathing, worse dignity. At the beginning of the night, they had spread themselves out to own the room. Now they were stacked into one miserable knot beside a battered wall, groaning and blinking and trying not to meet anybody's eyes. For a few seconds nothing moved except dust and breath. Then Terence, who had not yet exhausted his interest in justice, planted the crutch under one arm and limped behind the bar. The manager watched him go with the dazed expression of a man who has survived a storm only to see one more strange thing step out of the clouds. Terence rummaged for a moment, came back with an old hat, and stood before the biker pile, like a collector arriving on schedule. He held the hat out. "Damage payment," he said. "Restaurant improvements." The leader looked up at him as if he could not decide whether this was insult or madness. Terence tapped the floor once with the crutch. "You broke tables, you spilled beer, you ruined the atmosphere. We're not calling that free." No one moved. The big man, who had returned to an easy standing position near the bar and seemed almost disappointed the exercise was over, lifted his eyes and glanced toward the pile. That did it. The first biker dug into his pocket and pulled out cash with fingers that did not want to work. He dropped the bills into the hat. Another surrendered a wallet. Another added a watch, then a ring, because Terence kept holding the hat there and making no sign of leaving. The leader tried to hesitate, but one knock of the crutch against the floor and one look from the big man changed his heart at once. Soon the hat held money, watches, a chain, a few crumpled receipts, one ugly ring, and enough wounded pride to furnish a museum. Terence peered inside and nodded. "That's a start." Then he moved the hat toward the last holdout, who fumbled with both hands and nearly cried from the effort of getting his wallet free. Only when the hat had made the full round did Terence step back. He looked at the pile, then at the wreck of the room, then at the manager, who was still trying to decide whether this counted as catastrophe or blessing. "Could use new chairs," Terence said, "maybe a stronger table or two." He said it like a man discussing weather damage after a bad storm, not like somebody who had just been slapped to the floor in his own restaurant and then watched 5 grown men get folded into one corner like laundry nobody wanted to claim. The easy tone of it did more to settle the room than any speech could have. The bikers, on the other hand, did not look ordinary at all anymore. They looked flattened, confused, sore in places they had not known could ache, and most of all insulted by the fact that the evening had ended in a hat being passed under their noses like they were paying church dues. One had a split lip, one was holding his ribs. The leader had lost every last bit of the swagger he had come in with, and now sat on the floor with his back to the wall, breathing through his mouth and trying not to look at anybody. Terence gave the hat a small shake, listening to the weight of money, watches, rings and wallets settle together. The sound pleased him. He limped over to the nearest clear table, tipped the hat, and let the whole miserable harvest spill out across the wood. Bills, coins, watches, a chain, a couple of rings, and enough worn leather to suggest none of the men had ever had a good, honest plan in their pockets to begin with. He looked over the spread like a shopkeeper considering inventory. "Not bad," he said. "Not classy, but not bad." The manager still had both hands on the edge of the bar. His eyes moved from the heap of ruined bikers to the money on the table, then to the large man who had already gone back to the bar and sat down as if his supper had merely been delayed by an interruption too dumb to respect. The big man picked up his beer, took a swallow, and gave a slow exhale that carried all the weary patience of somebody who had once again been dragged into nonsense by people too young to know better. Terence glanced around the room and lifted a hand with the old showman's instinct still alive in him. "Everybody all right?" A few nods came back. Somebody muttered yes. Somebody else said they had seen worse, though that sounded like a lie told for personal pride. The child who had laughed earlier was now peeking over a chair with both eyes wide, as if he had just watched a bedtime story walk in off the street and start slapping people. Terence looked down again at the money. "New chairs," he repeated, tapping one finger against the table. "A sturdier front table. Maybe fix the door before the next group of geniuses decides to come in like a parade float." That got a small laugh from one corner of the room, then another. The sound started timid, then settled into the place with relief mixed into it. Once fear breaks, folks are often grateful for anything that sounds familiar, and Terence talking about furniture like he had just survived a rough lunch crowd was more comforting than logic had any right to be. He gathered the cash into a pile and nudged the jewelry aside. "This one pays for the broken glass. This one pays for the beer. This one," he said, lifting a ring between thumb and finger, "pays for your patience, which tonight has been expensive." From the bar came a dry voice. "My patience ran out an hour ago." Terence looked over and grinned. "There he is. Knew you'd find your voice once the work was done." The big man did not smile, not exactly, but there was a shift at one corner of his mouth that came close enough for anyone who knew him. He set the beer down and gave Terence a level look, the kind old friends give each other when the joke is familiar and the affection underneath it is even older. "What I found," he said, "was 5 idiots and 1 limping actor with no sense of timing." A few people in the restaurant glanced between them, picking up now that whatever had happened in this room had not happened between strangers. Terence took his crutch under one arm and walked a little closer, still smiling, still riding that loose energy that comes after surviving something ugly and getting the better end of it. "No sense of timing," Terence said. "I thought I was excellent. You let them kick you around too long." He's still not quite back to himself after everything that had just happened. His hands kept wiping the same spot on the counter while he stared at the big fellow sitting there sipping his beer like none of the broken glass or overturned tables had anything to do with him. After a long pause, the manager finally found enough voice to speak, though the words came out stumbling and low. Who is he, anyway?" Terence turned toward him with that old sly grin that everybody who knew him recognized right away. He gave a little tilt of his head toward the big man at the bar, who was still drinking his beer as calm as if the night had been perfectly ordinary. "You mean you still haven't figured it out?" He let the question hang there for a second, clearly enjoying the moment, then said it plain and slow. "That's Bud Spencer." The whole restaurant went quiet for half a second. You could feel the name settle over the room while folks took it in. A couple of the older customers sat up straighter, exchanging looks like they were trying to make sure they had heard right. The manager's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Bud Spencer," he repeated almost to himself. "Good Lord." He wiped his palms on his apron, suddenly self-conscious. "I grew up watching you." Bud looked at him, then at the beer. "You and a lot of other people." The manager gave a short, nervous laugh. "I can't believe you're here." Terence leaned in at once, unwilling to let admiration gather too neatly around anybody else. "Excuse me, I'm here too. Broken leg and all. Very brave. Very underappreciated." That got the room laughing again. The manager turned, pointed at Terence, and shook his head in amazement. "You knew he was coming." "Come. All evening," Terence said. And you still let those maniacs knock you around? Terence looked toward Bud with complete innocence. I had faith. The big man at the bar gave a small tilt of his head, not confirming and not denying anything. He just lifted his glass and took another slow sip of beer, acting like the name and all the attention had nothing to do with him. Terence put a hand to his chest like he had been accused of stealing from a widow, and I was testing him. That finally brought a clearer look from Bud. Testing me? Terence nodded with great seriousness. Of course. Wanted to see if you still remembered the script. Bud leaned back slightly on the stool and looked at him in the same dry way he had probably looked at him for years. The script? Yes, Terence said. Big entrance. Silent disapproval. Strange gestures. Sudden violence. Very classic structure. People expect quality at our age. A laugh slipped out of the manager then, half from nerves and half because the absurdity of it had finally reached him. Terence heard it and pointed at him as if proving a point to the whole room. You see, he gets it. Bud took another drink of beer. Your version of testing nearly got your head slapped off. Terence touched his cheek and shrugged. Only partly off. You could have hit back sooner. I could have, Terence admitted, then tilted his head toward Bud. But then I wouldn't have learned whether you still knew your cue. Bud's eyes moved over Terence's bad leg, the red mark on his face, and the broken remains of the evening. My cue, he said, was apparently to save a stubborn old fool from getting himself turned into floor decor. That pulled a fuller laugh from the room. Even the trucker at the counter smiled into his glass. Terence spread one hand. And yet you delivered beautifully. Bud gave a small shrug. Still effective. Terence burst out laughing at that, loud and open. The kind of laugh that comes easiest after a hard turn goes your way. He leaned the crutch against the table and steadied himself with one palm, not because he was weak, but because the leg had earned the right to complain by then. Bud snorted once. You had bad judgment. Faith, Terence repeated. Bad judgment. Terence grinned. See. Still the same. No warmth at all. Bud looked him over once more, from hair to boot to bad leg. You don't deserve warmth. You deserve a new leg. Terence clutched his chest in fake offense. You hear that? After all these years, he still talks to me like this. Bud lifted one shoulder. Still works. This time Terence laughed so hard he had to catch the edge of the table, and because relief had finally reached every last corner of the place, the whole restaurant laughed with him. The manager laughed. The trucker laughed. The older couple laughed. Even the child, though he probably did not understand half of what made it funny, laughed because everybody else had remembered how. And in that little restaurant, under lights that had seen fear, broken glass, bad men, and one old friendship step back into its own rhythm, the night closed not with threats or groans from the corner, but with the easy sound of people who had been frightened and were now grateful to be in the company of men who knew how to turn humiliation into a joke and trouble into a story worth retelling. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes with a mix of action and humor, and it does not fully reflect any real event. Beyond the exciting confrontations, the story also leaves behind a lesson about courage, staying calm under pressure, true friendship, and the way a person can reclaim dignity even when pushed into their weakest moment. Sometimes strength is not just in a fist, but in courage, quick thinking, and a friend who shows up at the right time. If you enjoyed this story and found something meaningful in it, please leave a like, drop a comment to share your thoughts, and share it with others as well. Your support means a lot and helps inspire more stories like this.